Have you ever felt like someone is slowly drifting away from you right when everything seemed to be going just right? It begins in small, almost unnoticeable ways. A slower reply than usual, a subtle change in tone, a little less warmth, a little less presence. And suddenly, the connection that once felt effortless starts to feel uncertain. You pick up on it, but you can't fully explain it. At first, you try to brush it off, hoping it's just temporary. But deep down, something feels different. Something feels off. And then your mind starts speaking. Did I say something wrong? Did I get too close? Are they starting to lose interest in me? These thoughts don't arrive gently. They come with intensity. They come with fear. Because when someone you care about shifts their behavior, your brain doesn't stay relaxed. It moves into protection mode. It tries to prepare you for rejection, even if rejection hasn't actually happened yet. This is how human psychology operates. The moment uncertainty shows up, your mind begins searching for answers. But instead of looking for truth, it often jumps straight to the worst-case scenario. It assumes distance means disinterest. It assumes silence means the end. And without even noticing it, you begin to pull away as well. Not because you want to, but because you're trying to avoid getting hurt. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself something honestly. What if what you're seeing isn't what you think it is? What if that distance isn't a sign of losing you, but a reaction to something much deeper? Because here's something many people fail to realize. Not everyone expresses emotions in the same way. Not everyone moves closer when they start to feel something real. Some people do the exact opposite. They step back. They go quiet. They create distance. From the outside, it looks like they are drifting away. It feels like they are disconnecting. It feels like you're being pushed out of their world. But inside them, something completely different might be happening. Inside, there could be pressure. There could be confusion. There could be a silent struggle between what they feel and what they fear. And this is where everything becomes fragile, because your reaction to their distance can either bring you closer to understanding or push both of you further apart. Most people struggle in this moment. They panic. They overanalyze. They chase for answers. Or they shut down entirely. They try to protect their heart before it gets broken. So they mirror the distance. They withdraw. They build emotional walls. Without realizing it, they turn a temporary shift into a permanent ending. All because they misunderstood what was really happening. This isn't weakness. It's human nature. When connection feels threatened, your instinct is to either fight for it or run away from it. But both reactions, when driven by fear, often lead to the same outcome: disconnection. Now imagine this. Imagine standing in a moment filled with uncertainty. You don't know if they are coming closer or moving away. You don't know if their silence means confusion or goodbye. And in that exact moment, you make one decision: to leave before you are left. It feels strong. It feels like self-respect. It feels like control. But what if that decision was based on a misunderstanding? What if you walked away not from rejection, but from something that was only just beginning to grow? This is where awareness changes everything. Because not all distance is the same. Some distance is intentional. Some comes from emotional confusion. And some is triggered by feelings that are simply too intense to handle. If you can't tell the difference, you will always react the wrong way. And the cost of that mistake could be losing something that might have been meaningful. So before you assume the worst, before you let fear take over, you need to understand what you're actually dealing with, because what looks like a step back might not be an ending at all. It might be a shift, a moment where emotions become too real, too quickly, a moment where someone doesn't know how to move forward, so they pause instead. And if you don't understand this moment, you will misinterpret it every single time. But if you do understand it, you gain something powerful, clarity. And clarity changes everything. It changes how you react. It changes how you think. It changes how you handle situations that once made you anxious. It allows you to respond instead of react. It helps you see beyond surface behavior and recognize what's really happening underneath. There is a point where everything inside a person begins to shift. Not on the outside, where it's easy to notice, but deep within, where thoughts become louder than actions and emotions begin to feel overwhelming. This is the moment most people completely misread. From your perspective, it looks like hesitation. It feels like uncertainty. It appears as though they are slowly stepping away from something meaningful. But internally, something far more complex is happening, something that doesn't follow clear logic, something that might not even make sense to them. It's like an internal disruption. One moment, everything feels safe and natural. There is comfort, there is ease, there is a connection that flows effortlessly. And then, without warning, a wave of discomfort appears. Not because anything went wrong, but because something became too real. This is where the shift begins. Their mind starts processing emotions on a deeper level. Thoughts become heavier. Questions begin to surface, not necessarily about you, but about what this connection could mean for them. They start thinking about how close they are getting, about how much they are beginning to feel. And instead of leaning into those emotions, they pause. Not because they don't care, but because caring begins to feel like a risk. You have to understand something important here. For certain people, closeness isn't just a positive experience. It is also tied to fear. Not the kind of fear that is obvious and loud, but the kind that quietly shapes decisions without being fully recognized. The fear of losing control. The fear of depending on someone. The fear of being emotionally exposed in ways they are not ready for. So when emotions deepen, their system doesn't respond with excitement. It responds with caution. They begin analyzing every interaction. They question their own feelings. They create mental space before things become too intense. It's not planned. It's not a deliberate decision in the way you might think. It's automatic. This is where confusion grows on both sides. You see withdrawal while they feel pressure. You look for reassurance while they look for space. And without understanding, both people begin moving in opposite directions, even though the connection itself hasn't actually lost its value. This internal conflict is exhausting for them, because part of them wants to stay present. Part of them recognizes the bond. They feel the comfort, the familiarity, the sense that something meaningful is forming. But another part of them signals danger. Not danger from you, but from the situation itself. Because getting closer means becoming vulnerable. And vulnerability is something they have learned to avoid rather than embrace. So what happens next is subtle but significant. They slow down. They become less expressive. They pull back just enough to regain a sense of control. From your perspective, it feels like something is fading. But from their perspective, it feels like they are trying to stabilize something that suddenly became too overwhelming to manage. This is the internal conflict. It's not a clear decision. It's not a conscious choice where they sit down and decide to create distance. It's a reaction driven by deeper emotional patterns, patterns that were formed long before you ever became part of their life. And this is why logic alone cannot fully explain their behavior, because even they may not completely understand why they are acting this way. They just feel the need to step back. They feel that something inside them is moving too fast, and they need to slow it down before it becomes too much. Now here is where most people make a critical mistake. They take this reaction personally. They assume it reflects their worth. They believe it means they are not enough. They start thinking they did something wrong, even when nothing specific actually caused the shift. And in response, they either push harder or shut down completely. Both reactions create more pressure, and pressure is exactly what triggered the withdrawal in the first place. So instead of creating clarity, it deepens the disconnect. But when you understand what is truly happening beneath the surface, everything begins to change. You stop seeing it as rejection. You begin to recognize it as a protective response, a response that isn't about pushing you away permanently, but about creating emotional breathing room. This doesn't mean every situation will lead to something meaningful. It doesn't mean every person will come back closer, but it does mean that not every moment of distance is what it appears to be, too. Sometimes it's a sign that emotions have reached a level where they can no longer be ignored, and instead of moving forward with confidence, the person experiencing them doesn't yet know how to handle that depth. So they pause. They pull back slightly. They try to restore their sense of balance, and if you don't understand this phase, you will misread it every time. You will interpret silence as absence. You will mistake hesitation for lack of interest. You will see space as a final goodbye. But in reality, this moment is often the beginning of something they are still trying to process. And the way you interpret this moment will shape everything that comes next. Because in the next layer of understanding, you begin to uncover something even deeper. You start to see why this distance is not random, why it only appears under certain emotional conditions, and what it truly reveals about how they feel. Once you grasp that, you will never look at this behavior in the same way again. What makes this situation even harder to understand is that the very moment that feels the most confusing to you is often the moment that carries the deepest meaning for them. It doesn't appear meaningful on the surface. It doesn't feel warm or reassuring. In fact, it feels cold, distant, and uncertain. But beneath that surface, something important is happening. Something that most people never pause to recognize, because people do not react strongly to things that mean nothing to them. They don't become emotionally unsettled over something they don't value. They don't feel inner tension over someone who holds no importance in their life. When there is no attachment, there is no struggle, there is no confusion, there is no internal resistance. Everything stays simple. So when you begin to notice a sudden change, when their behavior becomes inconsistent, when their presence feels unstable, it is not always a sign that feelings are fading. Sometimes it is the opposite. Sometimes it is a sign that feelings have reached a level where they can no longer remain comfortable. This is the part most people never see. They only notice what is visible. They only focus on what is being shown externally. They judge based on actions alone without understanding the emotional process happening underneath. And because of that, they come to the wrong conclusion. They assume that distance equals disinterest. They believe that inconsistency equals lack of care. They decide that silence means absence of emotion. But human behavior is not always that simple, especially when someone is not used to handling strong emotional connections. For certain individuals, deep feelings do not immediately create closeness. They create inner conflict. On one side, there is a natural pull toward the connection, a sense of comfort, a quiet recognition that this bond is different, that it carries something real, something rare. But on the other side, there is resistance, a voice that questions everything, a feeling that says, "This is too much," a reaction that pushes them to slow things down before they lose control. This internal push and pull creates a pattern that looks confusing from the outside. One moment they seem engaged. The next moment they seem distant. One moment they show interest. The next moment they become hard to read. And for someone on the receiving end, this feels unstable. It feels like mixed signals. It feels like emotional inconsistency. But what you are actually witnessing is someone struggling to manage something they are not fully comfortable experiencing. Because when emotions become intense, they require a level of openness that not everyone is ready for. They require trust. They require letting go of control. They require stepping into a space where outcomes are uncertain. And for someone who has learned to stay guarded, this is not easy. So instead of moving forward naturally, they hesitate. They create space to think. They try to understand what they are feeling before allowing themselves to go deeper. This does not mean the connection is weak. In many cases, it means the connection has become strong enough to trigger a response that is not about you directly, but about their own internal limits and emotional boundaries. This is why not every withdrawal should be treated as a signal to give up, because if someone truly feels nothing, there is no struggle to manage. There is no need to step back and reflect. There is no emotional tension to deal with. Everything remains simple and clear. But when there is depth, things become more complicated. Emotions do not always move in a straight line. They move in waves. They rise. They fall. They pause. And sometimes they retreat before they can move forward again. If you only understand the surface, you will misinterpret those waves as instability, rather than recognizing them as part of a deeper emotional process. This is where awareness becomes powerful. Because once you understand that not all distance is a sign of loss, you stop reacting out of fear. You stop making decisions based on assumptions. You begin to observe more carefully. You begin to respond with clarity instead of emotion. And that shift changes everything, because instead of pushing or pulling, instead of chasing or shutting down, you create a different kind of space. A space where things are not forced. A space where pressure is reduced. A space where understanding replaces confusion. And in that kind of space, something important can happen. The person who stepped back can begin to feel safe enough to move forward again. Not because they were forced, not because they were chased, but because the intensity that once felt overwhelming no longer feels threatening. This is the stage most people never reach, because they react too quickly. They assume too much. They act based on fear instead of understanding. And as a result, they close a door that might have opened in a completely different way. But when you see beyond the surface, when you understand that emotional depth can sometimes look like distance, you gain an advantage that most people never have. You stop confusing temporary retreat with permanent loss. You stop labeling complex emotions as simple disinterest. And most importantly, you stop walking away from something that may not be what it seems. Because in the final phase, everything comes down to one thing. Not what they feel, but how you respond when this moment appears. And that response is what ultimately determines whether this connection fades away or transforms into something stronger. Everything now comes down to a single moment. Not when things felt easy, not when everything flowed naturally, but right here, when uncertainty reaches its peak and your emotions begin to demand a reaction. This is where most connections either break or evolve. Not because of what they feel, but because of how you choose to respond when things stop being clear. At this stage, your mind will push you toward immediate action. It will tell you to do something right away, to fix it, to control it, to secure clarity as quickly as possible. Because the human mind does not like confusion. It wants answers. It wants certainty. It wants stability. But here is the challenge. Acting too quickly in this moment often creates the exact outcome you are trying to avoid. If you push for reassurance with urgency, it creates pressure. If you demand clarity before they are ready, it creates resistance. If you react emotionally without understanding, it builds distance that becomes harder to repair. And if you walk away too soon, you might end something that was never truly over. So what do you do instead? You slow down. Not in a passive way, but in a controlled, aware, and intentional way. You stop trying to force a result. You stop trying to control how they should feel. and you start focusing on how you choose to show up, because this moment is not just a test of the connection, it is a test of your emotional strength. Can you stay grounded when things feel uncertain? Can you remain steady when your thoughts try to pull you into fear? Can you avoid reacting in ways that come from insecurity rather than clarity? This is where real strength begins, because when you do not react impulsively, you create something rare. You create emotional safety, and emotional safety is something that changes everything for someone who struggles with closeness. It shows them that not every connection demands immediate answers. It shows them that not every bond comes with pressure. It shows them that space does not automatically lead to loss. This does not mean you ignore your own needs. It does not mean you accept confusion forever. It means you understand timing. Because every emotional process has its own rhythm, and trying to rush that rhythm only creates imbalance. So instead of chasing, you allow things to breathe. Instead of withdrawing completely, you stay present without overwhelming them. Instead of assuming the worst, you remain open to understanding what is still unfolding. This balance is not easy. It requires patience. It requires self-control. It requires the ability to sit with uncertainty without letting it control your actions. But this is exactly what separates reactions that damage connections from responses that allow them to grow. Because when someone experiences distance without pressure, something begins to shift inside them as well. They start to feel less threatened. They start to feel less overwhelmed. They begin to process their emotions without the added weight of expectation. And over time, this creates space for something important to develop: clarity. Not forced clarity, but natural clarity. The kind that comes when someone has enough room to understand what they truly feel without being pushed in any direction. And when that clarity appears, their actions begin to align with it. They move forward, not because they were chased, but because they chose to. They open up, not because they were pressured, but because they feel safe enough to do so. And this is where everything changes. Because a connection that survives this stage does not remain the same. It becomes stronger. It becomes more aware. It becomes something that is no longer driven by fear, but by understanding. But there is something important to remember. Not every situation will lead to this outcome. Not every person will reach that point of clarity. And that is why your focus should never be on controlling the result. Your focus should be on how you handle the process, because when you handle it with awareness, you protect yourself from unnecessary pain. You stop making decisions based on assumptions. You stop reacting in ways that create regret, and you start moving with confidence even when things feel uncertain. This is what gives you an advantage that most people never develop: the ability to stay calm when others panic. The ability to understand when others misinterpret, the ability to respond with clarity when others react with emotion. And that changes the entire dynamic, because in a world where most people either chase or run, choosing to remain balanced is what sets you apart. It creates a different kind of presence, a presence that is not driven by fear, a presence that is not dependent on immediate answers, a presence that allows things to unfold naturally in a way that reveals the truth instead of forcing it. And in the end, that is what matters most. Not assumptions, not overthinking, not reacting to every shift, but understanding what is real and allowing it to show itself over time. Because sometimes what looks like distance is not the end of something meaningful. Sometimes it is the moment that determines whether something fragile breaks or transforms into something strong enough to last.